them in prison, it's also costly to the communities they leave behind and return to. Phil Jones reports.
Welcome to Brownsville, a pocket of poverty inside Brooklyn, New York, a place where crime and prison often are a way of life.
Both of my parents are drug addicts. My father wasn't at home.
I went to prison for murder in the second degree.
First time for robbery, 2 years, second time for robbery, 12 years, and the third time for drug possession.
I was out hustling narcotics. What I would have to tell Mom is, Mom, I found, a whole bunch of money. You know, when I know I would see Mom crying because she was behind on bills or something like that. I would come in and say, you know, Mom, look, I found XYZ, you know. She was like, oh, you know, God is good, this and that.
But Vincent Matos' mother is proud of her 42-year-old son.
Hotep, brothers, how y'all doing?
He now roams these troubled streets as a community activist. He knows the turf.
Young men that's out on the corner from sunup to sundown, falling back to doing what they know to do, to earn a living, because there's no job for them. There's no helpful reentry program that's in place right now. Whatever you want, you can get it on this strip. Drugs, sex, and guns. That's what's major out here.
What else is major? The pervasive presence of police, with the task of arresting the bad guys and putting them behind bars. There is no doubt that police activity decreases crime. But is there a tipping point when legitimate law enforcement designed to protect the public may have unintended consequences, promoting poverty, even more crime?
The current overuse and overdependence on criminal justice is a complete failure. It's having no impact on these issues of public safety and crime. That's not to say there isn't a need for a level of criminal justice, but this radical overuse is not accomplishing those goals.
In the 1970s, there were about 200,000 inmates in U.S. prisons. Today, there are about 2 million. For years, law enforcement used crime mapping to target places where the crimes were being committed. Eric Cadora, director of an organization called the Justice Mapping Center, is an advocate for sentencing reform and prison alternatives. He proposed another use for mapping.
I said, well, what if we don't do crime mapping? What if instead we mapped where people lived who were going into jail and prison every year? When we started doing maps of where people lived, we found hugely concentrated neighborhoods where vast majorities of people were going to prison and jail and coming back, and other neighborhoods where nearly none were. This is New York City. The brightest red show the highest rate per 1,000 adults, male adults admitted to prison for a single year. Let's say there's about 100,000 people living in Brownsville. About half of them are male, that's about 50,000. About between 10 and 13% are going to prison and jail every year.
This increased prison population has come at a staggering cost to taxpayers.
We can now calculate block by block how much we're spending to remove and return people en masse from and back to that block.
This cluster of housing projects is what Cadora calls a $1 million block.
We found about 150 individual blocks in New York City for which we were spending more than $1 million a year to remove and return people to prison and jail.
Cadora uses dark red to show the concentrations. They are maps that call for new directions.
What these maps have done is accumulate the effect over the course of a year of a criminal justice imprisonment system. What's heated up here is a mass migration back and forth from this neighborhood to prisons upstate and back. So what we're seeing here is constant grappling with resettlement, with disruption, with the costs of having to move, make up for income, split families, tough health care. But you don't see that when you drive through.
What's up, Ed?
Greg Jackson, another civic activist and a lifelong resident of Brownsville, doesn't need a map. He's seen his own community imprisoned.
Incarceration is not just the individual going to jail, but it's the whole family going to jail from Brownsville. Everybody's suffering from it.
How's that?
You know, because when this individual comes out of jail, he still can't find employment. And that person the kids that he left behind, the parents that he left behind, the wife that he left behind, they all suffered in the interim. You know, so and when he comes out, you're thinking, wow, it's a good time. My father's coming out of jail. My mother's going out of jail. There's nothing good about it.
For one thing, felons aren't allowed to live in these public housing projects, although some do. Others end up homeless, and most are jobless. Ask DeJohn Smith, still struggling 8 years after his release.
I've done odd jobs, like I couldn't even begin to tell you how many. I went to an interview like several months ago, and once they learned of my conviction, they looked at me like, don't call us, we'll call you.
After decades of hardline policies on crime, tough justice, more and more communities are looking into what is called justice reinvestment.
Let us take the investments that had been built up over the years from criminal justice, redirect them to investments in civil institutions in those neighborhoods. Better schools, better health care, better mental health support, and so on. In many of the states where the Justice Reinvestment Initiative has taken root, prison populations are either dropping or the trend line in growth has been radically reduced. And that's from Connecticut to Kansas, liberal to conservative.
Most of the crimes are connected to violence, drugs, and alcohol. But researchers found another reason for the increased prison populations.
We found states where 65% of everyone entering prison each year were entering as the result of a revocation of parole and probation.
That was the case in Kansas, so legislators passed a new law, a new direction, committing taxpayer dollars to cities and communities that change parole and probation regulations that will reduce the prison population by 20%.
That's kind of what the reinvestment project is about. It's about saying, look, if you can reduce it, we'll give you the money to keep reducing it.
According to Cadora, states are being forced to rethink their hardline, throw the criminals in jail attitude because, especially in these hard economic times, the criminal justice system is too costly, both financially and psychologically.
They realize that this overwhelming overuse of criminal justice is one of the greatest threats to sort of civil society.
This threat to society, this impact on communities in prison, can be felt on the streets and inside the crowded housing projects. We met Matoka Belton. She didn't want us to see her 3 children. Their father went to prison. What was he in prison for?
Number of things. And it was due to survival.
What was the impact on the children of him being away?
It's hard because they're like, you know, what school is this? Because you try not to say he's in prison. Oh, this is school. What school is this that they don't come home? It's college. But then it comes to a point where they get a certain age and you can't lie anymore. I was once an inmate myself. So, and I know what it was like for my children to feel like, wow, my mother's not here. Why can't mommy come home with us? It's hard to leave a visit.
It's a cruel cycle. Poverty, crime, prison, passed from one generation to the next. A child whose parent went to prison is likely to end up behind bars too.
When you look at a kid and you say, how could that kid, done such a crime like that? Because he never really was told that was something wrong to do. He never celebrated Christmas with the family or sat down at the dinner table with the family.
About 700,000 inmates come back home every year. Most are unprepared for reentry, and their communities are unprepared for their return. As the U.S. government is making huge investments in industries and businesses, it is now being forced to also address a broken justice system, a system in desperate need of a stimulus package of sorts. Justice reinvestment. For Religion and Ethics News Weekly, I'm Phil Jones in Brooklyn, New York.
On our calendar this week, on Friday, behind